Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Joy Connolly. I'm honored to serve as president of the American Council of Learned Societies, and I'm happy, indeed, I'm thrilled to invite you to join us in this terrific panel of three panelists joining us in our final online webinar event of the year. It's a wonderful, I want to say both a celebration of a terrific year of public events and a great kickoff in advance for next year, where we will continue with a mix of online events for you. Today, this subject of this webinar is Beyond the Academy, Pathways to Non-Academic Careers for PhDs. I'm delighted to see so many people here. This is a topic absolutely central, dear to our hearts here at ACLS and among our ACLS community, including PhDs, graduate students, even aspiring undergraduates who are interested in the humanities and social sciences, people inside and outside the academy, people working beyond the classroom who have PhDs, people who are recent PhDs or completing graduate school who are interested in all kinds of diverse jobs, bringing humanistic knowledge, perspectives, and expertise to all manner of fields and sectors and lines of work, again, outside the classroom, beyond the classroom, as well as within, in all the nooks and crannies of academia. So as I say, this is dear to our hearts. ACLS has engaged in the work of advancing PhDs interested, as I said, in bringing humanistic knowledge to bear outside the classroom, beyond the classroom for many years. Well over 10 years ago, ACLS began with the support of the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, now known as the Mellon Foundation, the ACLS Mellon Public Fellows Program, a really vanguard program that certainly I can speak from personal experience, lifted my sense and my appreciation of just what humanities PhDs could do outside the academy. It placed PhDs for over 10 years in positions in a range of nonprofit organizations and groups. That the spirit of that program continues in our Leading Edge Fellowship, which places PhDs in the humanities, again, with the support of the Mellon Foundation, in positions in nonprofits devoted to advancing social justice. So again, we have a long history. I'll mention just one more thing. More recently, going back to interest in ACLS that was expressed and lived out in the 1990s. There was a lot of interest at that time under the leadership of Stan Katz. ACLS explored and lifted up the work of high school teaching for PhDs. We are reinvigorating that effort in our public events, featuring high school teachers in particular, and paths and career tracks for PhDs, a wonderful way to do great good in the world. Now, speaking of doing great good in the world, I am really delighted to welcome three leaders of major organizations, all of whom have PhDs in the humanities and social sciences, who are doing great good, moving the world forward in different ways. So let me introduce them. We're going to move then to a discussion among the four of us, and then we're going to move to questions, certainly no later than 5 o'clock, and maybe a little bit before that. Let me signal to the audience right now that if you have questions, feel free to enter them on the bottom of your Zoom screen. I'm sure this is familiar to all of you by now. Please use the Q&A to enter your questions. That's going to be the easiest way to do that. If the chat is enabled for you in the audience, I'm not sure that it is, but if you do use that, I won't be able to see the questions. I won't be able to track both at once. So please use the Q&A function and feel free again to enter in questions at any time. You don't have to wait till I invite them. So I look forward hugely to this discussion. And let me, as I say, briefly introduce our three eminent panelists. Tino Cuéllar is the president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He was a PhD in political science and brings a range of expertise in that area in his work beyond the classroom, beyond the academy. Stephanie Hull is the president and CEO of Girls Inc. She has a stellar career in independent education and took her PhD in French literature. And finally, Steve Kidd, the executive director of the National Humanities Alliance. Steve leads this advocacy organization, a hugely important organization for strengthening and opening up, broadening the impact of the humanities in the United States. he took his PhD in American Studies. I look forward to learning from them and providing concrete advice, concrete practical perspectives on how PhDs in the humanities and social sciences can make their way in the world beyond the classroom, people interested in exploring this journey, people interested in sharing the perspectives you're going to learn here with your students or friends or colleagues. So again, welcome everyone. So pleased to have you and pleased to begin our discussion. Now, I'll start by posing some questions to the group. So let me start with a question that comes up in every time we talk with PhDs in our programs. I mentioned the Leading Edge program already. That supports PhDs in the humanities specifically, but also in our public events and in the other several other venues where ACLS, through convenings or gatherings of graduate students and recent PhDs, they're always hungry for practical insight into how to navigate the world outside the college and the university. And one of the clusters of concerns that they have consistently is the question of networking. How do you get to know those people who will either open doors for you or give you advice? We see networking referred to, it's a buzzword on websites and in conferences and events on this topic. So each of you, and I can start with Tino, if that's all right, understanding that not everyone comes from privilege. I mean, most people don't come from privilege and so can't lean on people they know or family members who may be able to open doors. So with that understanding, can you provide some examples of how you created your own professional network?
Sure. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be part of this event. I'm really delighted, and ACLS is a terrific organization. I've admired it for years, benefited from it as a member of the American Political Science Association, and what a great panel. I'm delighted to be with these panelists. So I'll answer your question about networks, but first I just have to say one point of personal privilege. Anybody who's gotten a PhD will remember the equivalent of something like the following moments, which I remember very dramatically in this event because it's making me reflect on what challenges you have to overcome to get a PhD. Everything has gone your way after much effort, maybe trying to pull together the right topic, the right ideas, the right research, and you can't simply get your committee to agree on a date to do the final examination, and you're trying, and the day actually that you're supposed to have your oral exam, your committee chair doesn't show up. Or conversely, the other episode I'll just share is, like, you've gotten everything done, you've got the dissertation ready, you've gotten everything on acid-free paper the way it's required, and then you realize as you're about to turn in the darn thing that the font size is wrong and they're not going to accept it. So all that is to say, like, anybody who thinks that the only thing you learn to get a PhD is like depth of knowledge in a particular subject has a real poor appreciation for everything we all have to navigate about this. But of course, part of what we have to navigate, to your point, is the sociology of academia. Like, how in the world do you figure out like who your advisors should be, and how to put together a committee, and how to navigate that incredibly tense sort of intersection of, like, you want to be bold and different, but you don't want to sort of pick a fight with everyone in your field. And I guess my point about network is, when I began to broaden my network well beyond academia through volunteering in nonprofits, through political campaigns, to be honest, through working non-academic jobs in DC, I thought a lot about how academia was like a foreign world for me in some ways when I first started making it in the PhD program. And the same process of trying to figure out the sociology of a network that had helped me in academia was going to help me in other ways too. And it just sort of meant some degree of willingness to take no for an answer when you reach out to people and you want to just have coffee with them, and some won't have time for you. But 70, 80%, 70% of the people you ask will say yes. And of those, maybe 40, 50% will be really interested in you, not only because it's something they think you might be able to do for them, but because you know something interesting and deep that they don't, sometimes from your PhD. So it was a little bit sort of networking and volunteering, but always recognizing I had something interesting to share as well.
Thank you. I wonder, Stephanie, you want to jump in?
Yes, and I want to just quickly echo everything Tino said about my pleasure at being part of this group. I think for me, the question of networks also had a couple of extra layers, because networking still, and certainly in the day that I was trying to navigate networking, but networking has gender implications and race ethnicity implications there. And I think people mostly think networking, you find people who would respond positively to you, who are something like you, who would understand you, who would maybe naturally embrace you, because it's true that you have to be bold. It's true that you have to risk rejection, but I think it's also human nature to try to find someone that you think might respond well and might, take pity on you. There was absolutely nobody who looked anything like me in graduate school, and that has been true consistently. And what I had to learn to do, really without any real coaching, was just stick my neck out, was just risk somebody laughing as they shut the door in my face. And it was through a series of being patted on the head and said, you don't really want this job. I mean, my networking began even before I started the PhD, because I knew in my heart what I wanted was an administrative job at a university. And the only pathways I could see were through getting a PhD, coming up through the ranks, getting tenure, becoming the dean of the division, becoming the dean of the faculty. Those were the only things that were obvious to somebody outside. And every time I went into the office of an administrator and said, I'd like to be an administrator, they said, no, honey, no, you don't. And they were nice, but I got kind of kicked back out. And professors didn't respect the administration and wouldn't tell you how to become an administrator. And so really, I think that the concrete advice that I would provide is just to pull your socks up and say, 10 out of 10 of these people will probably say no, but they might say something as I'm leaving that gives me the seed of the next, person to knock on the door of. And for me, I knocked on the door of somebody who was then provost, who I really do think he probably laughed. He was a white male, older provost but he said, okay, read this and come back. And I read it and I came back and I had read it and I had good questions. And then he realized that while I probably was somewhat of a waste of his time, I wasn't a total waste of his time. And he gave me the time of day and said, you should meet this person. He sent a couple of emails and said, talk to this person. And that was how I did it. But I came from a place of, I didn't have any kind of natural proclivity toward network. That wasn't a thing we did as French majors. We were just a sort of little weird exclusive society. So no one taught us how, and nobody prepared us for what it would be like. But I think the only thing that really ever has stood me in good stead was to think, what have I got to lose? They won't remember me. I mean, it isn't like they're going to track you down and give you a hard time. They'll say no, or they'll say yes. And those are the only two, options. But it took a while though, before I was brave enough really to, even to face the no, because it's embarrassing. And you do, as Tino said, you do think you've kind of accomplished something. You've got some knowledge, you've written a really great dissertation, you want to be somebody, but sometimes in these offices, they're trying to thinking, who's that kid? And why does she think I have time for this? So that's the only thing I can really say, is just to, steel yourself, but take a risk.
And you're reminding me, Stephanie, that your advice and Tino's too is very good for any faculty in this audience now, or who might watch this tape, or any administrators, to keep the door open and to keep ears open and to respond with helpful information, even if you can't answer exactly the question the student is asking. Any perspective, any light you can shed is often helpful. But one has got to make the time to do that. So Steve, what about you?
Yeah, I certainly agree with the need for risk-taking and enduring embarrassment and getting into situations that are uncomfortable. In addition to that, I had an kind of uneasy relationship with graduate school. So I was kind of always both in graduate school doing my coursework, everything else, but also working on the side too. So I started off in museums and then continued to kind of work in museums as I went through graduate school. And that was both out of interest, but also out of economic necessity, going to graduate school in an expensive city and having fellowships that didn't quite meet all of the ends meet. So through those experiences, I was constantly in situations where I was practicing those networking skills and also practicing job interviewing and pitching what I knew to folks who might hire me for short-term gigs. And out of that experience too, I was part of a network of fellow students who were doing similarly. And we were always telling each other about jobs. So in some ways, that student network was the most important network to me. And I found being generous in that environment and always helping your fellow students, which I think also translates to the job search, the workplace. If you're generous in helping others find good places to be, to make connections, that will reflect back on you and help you find more opportunities as you move along too.
Thank you. Thank you all of you for those, exactly the sweet spot of kind of thinking big and also and about the big issues and some of the characterological issues of making the transition from graduate school to the world outside academia, but also practical advice. I want to ask a question that will let you open up a bit more about your own autobiographies, in a sense, your resumes as opposed to your CVs. And I hope also, and because I want to give a shout out to those people who are starting to ask questions right away, it would be great if we could also tackle the first question that was asked about the difference between having a PhD beyond what a BA or a master's could give, which is an excellent question from the perspective of employers as well as people going on the market seeking work. So, so with that question in mind, what was the extra oomph or maybe not an oomph that the PhD gave you? Could you talk about what? And I'll let people jump in now that we're warmed up. What was your first role outside of the academy, and what were some of the one or two of the really big differences you noticed in terms of the work you were doing in your first job, in terms of mindset or office culture, anything you would like to talk about? Please jump in.
I will jump in. My first job outside of the academy, technically it was still at a university, so it wasn't really that far afield. I became a dean in an interim role. There was a dean who left sort of mid-year, and I had in various contexts shown some interest in students that they thought was unusual, so I became a freshman dean. And it was only intended to be for a year while they sort of did the search. And an interesting thing that happened was that my colleagues were pretty upset. I think that they had worked pretty hard to recruit me and didn't understand why I wouldn't want to be really focused on my track as a professor going toward tenure. It was after I'd had my third year review. I was in the middle of my fourth year, and I wanted to step aside from the track, but they wouldn't actually stop the clock. They said, no, make a decision. And I didn't, since I didn't actually have the interim job, it was sort of a strange moment, but it has taken me where I wanted to go. But the thing, I think, I was around people on a campus, but you could sort of see already how the values were so different, even in that same community, how some people really valued a way of interacting with the students that was really different. Then that opened my eyes to the sort of student services side of things and to the careers that I've had leading a school and being part of organizations that support education for various kinds of people, and eventually working with girls and working with young people. I think what I didn't understand, because I had really been, all I did was go right to school, right to grad school. So I only ever was on college campuses. And even after that, I was only on college campuses and in schools until, maybe 10 years ago. I really only, the first day of school was the first day of school for me forever. What I've come to understand is that it's not that different, that certainly getting a PhD was different from getting a bachelor's degree. mine was, the master's was kind of rolled in, so it all happened at the same time, but just the intensity of focus on the thing that you care about, it carried me through a lot of other things in life. It didn't necessarily matter if the way I expressed that interest was reading and writing and thinking. What I think I learned in graduate school that has been useful and that has been interesting in different workplace settings is a lot of graduate school initially was about really talking without listening or thinking. It was about kind of elbowing in and being competitive in that way. And then learning, actually, you need to listen and think before you talk. And growing up in that tradition and seeing that flip was interesting in other contexts. It was interesting in other workplaces to see how people got their point across, how they conveyed information, how they conveyed their culture and kind of kept their traditions going. And it really isn't remarkably different. Now that I'm outside of academia and not on a college campus, it isn't that different. People have a thing that they value. They have a way of transmitting that culture, and they do it somehow in a really sort of stable way. And there are customs and there are processes that you have to follow, and people feel strongly about things, and you can't do things whole new ways unless you can explain the whole thing to everybody who's involved. I have really been surprised at how much that early education and formation has just been, it's just the same. It's, we really aren't different. And for that reason, I think PhDs, that I think about their intensity of focus and their ability to really double down on a thing that they care about and want to tell you about and get excited about, but it's the same, no matter whether people use that passion to get a PhD or used it to, protest, or, there are many other ways that passion comes out, but I don't really feel like we're all that different ultimately.
That's really interesting. I really enjoyed listening to that and thinking about it, Stephanie. I guess I see where you're coming from, and I agree. I wonder, let me come at it maybe a slightly different way, not in contradiction, but just to sort of complement that perspective. I do think in so many ways, all those of us who get a PhD have something in common with other people who have a long-term plan, put a lot of energy and time into deepening their knowledge of something. But when I think about the comparison between my experience in law school and PhD, or, friends of mine who are MDs or MBAs and PhD, I guess there are some things about the PhD that loom pretty large for me. Not to say that they aren't findable to some degree in other domains, but here are some things that stand out. So it feels to me like if you're gonna get a PhD in a field, you have to be passionate enough about the subject just to make it through. Even if your goal is pretty instrumental, I want this as a means to an end, you have to care enough about British literature, or about folk and myth in Latin America, or about urban sociology, just to make it through with all the, I'm trying to use a word other than crap you have to put up with, but just all the stuff you have to deal with. We can talk about the barriers to doing something outside of academia. There are a ton of barriers to doing things inside academia, and you get resistance sometimes even from people who should be your allies. I guess I'm channeling a sense that going from an undergrad interested in academia to being a grad student, I found was often as an undergrad interested in getting a PhD, your professor oh, that's so great, how exciting, future scholar. And then you get into the PhD program and they're okay, you're part of this huge sort of academic industrial complex. You have a role, you do this, you do that, you're one of many. Anyway, long story short. So there's something about real nuance you get in a subject that I think is elusive in most. I think maybe lawyers have it in law. I don't know that MBAs have it in business, the same level of nuance, that sense of holding contradictory ideas at the same time. Second, I think there's a methods piece, which even in the humanities, certainly in social science, is a big deal. Meta discourse about methods is not something, maybe the doctors have it a little bit in the lawyers, but again, I don't think the MPPs, the MBAs have that. And then third is just project planning. I think it's just easier to get any other degree than a PhD. There's just more you need to get to organize. And that's why some people take a while to get it. But to me, that's again, consistent with Stephanie's point that there are some special skills that others value outside and others get in other ways. But I think the PhD is pretty special. Yeah.
I'd quickly just add to that. I think you build the capacity to take leaps of faith, and big leaps of faith. I got to the point where just before I was getting ready to write my dissertation, I was working for a multimedia computer company, and I really enjoyed it. And I was making money, and it seemed like a good direction to go in the 90s, mid-90s. And I ended up deciding to stick with it and finish my PhD. And I think that what I kind of gained through that experience, in addition to many of the things you already mentioned, was the ability to kind of exist with uncertainty beyond what I could have imagined before then. That has subsequently just served me well in taking on a variety of roles and switching roles too. So I would say that that's one of the big differences between getting a PhD and entering the workforce with the BA.
That's in what really all of you are making this point in different ways that, or have alluded to it, that in fact, what graduate students in PhD students and faculty do, it is difficult to describe even in a paragraph. I mean, the job is really multifarious, and that's that deftness of switching tracks and being able to both think and and hold contradictory ideas in one's head, as Tino said, but also simply to shift from teaching to going to the library, to managing a colloquium, to dealing with a department manager, to, the job is multifarious in ways that people outside academia don't understand often. And I think one of the challenges for PhDs, and again, one of the questions we get asked or that comes up in events like these all the time, is exactly this. How would you advise current graduate students or recent PhDs or PhDs seeking jobs outside of academia? How do you advise them to translate their skills and capacities into language that your colleagues who have no knowledge of academe would understand and resonate with and admire? And what are the hooks that honestly convey some sense of the work or flavor of the work to an audience that has never had a foot anywhere near the work in academia?
I think that's a great question. But before we go to that, I wanted to just add one more very practical thing to the question of, like, what does a PhD get you that a master's degree or no graduate degree gets you? And it goes back to something Stephanie said earlier, which I thought was really interesting. We could argue about whether it's good or bad for society to have credentialing requirements for certain kinds of jobs, but they do exist, and they exist outside of being a professor. And there are at least 3 kinds of institutions, maybe more, but at least 3 kinds where you're not an academic, but if you don't have a doctorate, you're actually going to have a hard time having those jobs. Directing museums, directing think tanks, and colleges and schools that are not the traditional higher, like, research university, but whether it's community college or private school and so on, having a PhD is at least a big advantage to my mind. So I guess it's just fair to note that there might still be instrumental reasons to get it, even if it's not ideal for society. But that's just the reality that we live in. As far as how to tell the story of, like, what's valuable, I think it helps if one markets intersections between either volunteer activity or, as Stephen was suggesting, job activity that one is doing while in grad school, and the stuff one learned or is learning in grad school. Like, in my case, I sort of volunteered on political campaigns and could tell a story about how what you're learning in statistics and econometrics and political science is, like, deeply relevant to understanding the context of how campaigns make decisions, like what's going on in the big picture, what kind of polling is really nonsensical versus actually quite thoughtful, what kind of A/B testing makes sense, or for fundraising, just kind of understanding how to strategize a little bit and use data about those things. But I also think relating the graduate degree to some personal experience one has can be powerful as a way of getting people to connect. Because I think everybody can connect to the idea that you make certain professional choices based on life experience in a way that's harder for them to connect if you say, I just went to get that degree because I just had this quirky, weird interest in this field. But if you say instead, like, well, I grew up in these kinds of environments, I got interested in this because of a teacher who inspired me, I just find that it makes it easier for people to relate.
Thank you. Stephanie.
I would say that, I mean, I really agree with Tino. I think that it's harder if you don't have a degree that's really relevant in any kind of modern context. I mean, I've got a PhD in Romance languages, so I didn't ever have a job that was related to it besides being a TA, and probably never will have a job that's related to it because it really was esoteric. And I think I struggle with that a little bit because I do think if it's possible I went through school on scholarships. I was awarded money to do this research, and I was fairly young and went straight through after undergrad. So those were the perfect conditions for someone to get a degree just because they could. And at the time, I knew that I admired jobs that were related. I loved college campuses. I wanted to spend the rest of my life on one, but it wasn't that I necessarily thought I was doing job training for that job. I was sort of going through life getting a terminal degree in a thing that I cared about. And in the work that I do now, I would actually like to be able to say to young people that can be a thing. I don't know if I'd advise somebody to go deep into debt over it, but if you can find somebody who thinks that they might value your scholarship or your participation enough to pay for it and subsidize it through, the end of a degree. It has never hurt to have a degree in Romance languages. It has never also, it mattered only when I was a professor. But as soon as I left the tenure track, just the fact of the degree, as Tino said, just the fact that the degree was PhD and that it didn't hurt that it said Harvard, but that's all anybody cared about. They don't even really know what Romance languages means after that, for the most part. And they don't really think about the depth of study and the time I spent and the navigation of, for me, it was the margins on my dissertation when I went to turn it in. The margins were wrong and I had to pay for all that paper over again. But nobody really appreciates that. I hadn't actually thought about that until today. Thank you, Tino, for bringing back a traumatic experience from my young life. I think it's important to be able sometimes just to love a thing like that. And I think especially in the humanities, it's really hard for people just to major in anything that they care about. So I'm ambivalent. I'd love to be a role model for, it worked out great that I did this thing. It was really hard work. And a lot of times I wanted to quit and people made me miserable. But at the end of the day, I've never been sorry that I made it to the other end. I don't know if everybody knows what I learned. They'll never know all the things that I can do, but they might know that it is possible sometimes just to think the French Enlightenment is really interesting and people will pay me to read books and talk about it. And, for some number of people, that's a good thing, but it doesn't turn out to be a career. And I think that's okay too. I don't love the connection all the time between your education and your ultimate career goals. That's impractical. And I know that's back to the privilege question, but even for somebody who doesn't have the money to pay for it, I'd like it to be possible for some people to take the risk of just falling in love with a subject and, living the way a grad student does until you get to the end. And, I didn't have a lot of money, but I had enough that I could immerse myself in that. And, when I needed money, I had to stop doing it basically and get a real job. But I'd love to be able to say that is in itself a good experience to encourage people to do. We don't have to have a reason all the time or, an end game or a really practical strategy.
Certainly, I would want to add to that, Stephanie, that in terms of the translating, and I'll see if you agree, in terms of the translating of a PhD and the experiences involved in getting one into a job cover letter, that I find what you just said actually very compelling, as part of the frame story to say, and actually going back to what Tino said too about risk taking, and you both talked about that I am a person, to be able to say I am a person of whatever age, because this could be used at any stage of life and career, who fell passionately in love with, became preoccupied with X, dove into and finished an incredibly rigorous program of study. And, I am that kind of person. I bring energy, and it doesn't have to be passion, maybe, if it's, that may not be the right word, and that's overused these days too, but energy and commitment and the ability to see something through. Those themselves as experiences, not just I'm the kind of person who might be committed and energetic and able to see things through, but I am someone who has done this is a I know an important thing to be able to say. But Steve, what about you in terms of translation? How did you translate your skill? How would you advise?
I think I've never actually been asked to. That I've in a kind of job-seeking environment, I've never been in a situation where I've been really asked to translate it in that way. So I would come at it more from the perspective of the whole range of experiences you've had and thinking about my own applying for jobs, but also being on the other side, hiring PhDs for jobs that don't necessarily require a PhD. I do focus on the why did you do this question to kind of get at that passion and the sense that someone really is compelled by more than just wanting to have a job, but that they're mission driven in some kind of way. But then I also focus a lot on project management, the ability to deal with adverse situations. And there I'm also looking for experience outside of their graduate program and just thinking of, do they have a track record of working with a group of people collaboratively? Do they have a track record of managing deadlines, which graduate school can mean, but it also making sure that your CV becomes a resume that pulls in whatever experience you've had, that isn't just this narrow academic channel, but might include summer jobs you had before graduate school even. I frequently, in hiring people for production-oriented roles, have looked for restaurant experience. I've looked for retail experience. Those kinds of environments tell me that someone's able to kind of extend themselves beyond what their academic experience might be.
I love these comments. Can I just add something kind of inspired by both of you guys, both of you all? I think there are so many ways to make a case for how a PhD is relevant outside academia, but one theme seems to be to weave it into your story so that it makes sense as part of that story. It could be that you had a career goal. It could be that you had a personal experience connected to it. It could be that there's some interesting contrast between the PhD and the experience you had in another field, but just being able to say that it has some integral role in your life, that it reflects a kind of passion you had or whatever else you do to justify it. It's very helpful to not have it be just this thing hanging out there that was like a wrong turn, which whether it's true or not that it was a wrong turn, like is beside the point. It's ideally possible to weave it into the larger narrative.
I love that. And Steve, I want to just comment on a thing that you just said. I was at a meeting recently because of the work that I do. I'm part of a large gathering of people who are heads of big organizations like the American Red Cross and Habitat for Humanity and that kind of thing. And we were talking over dinner about all the jobs that are never on your resume, all the things that we know how to do that would make people laugh. Because if you look at what we present, it's this, sort of litany of things that are related to the thing we do that we think everybody would want to know and understand about us, but we don't say we were camp counselors. Nobody ever has that. But I mean, a lot of us were camp counselors or, did some other really strange job that made sense to us or is part of that story that Tino's talking about, but we don't talk about it. And it's not only the PhD that seems like maybe people shouldn't know, but I think maybe if there were some way to create a document that was really a literal CV, because I think being a camp counselor has a lot to do with what I do. And I think being a sixth grade teacher has a lot to do with what I do, but we just, we don't sort of tell people that part of our story a lot. And it seems like if you don't talk about that and put that into the story, it does feel like it's because you might be ashamed of it or not overtly proud of it, which turns out to be the same thing when you're talking to people. They can't tell whether you're hiding it because you figure it's not that important or they won't care, or whether you really hope nobody asks you.
That kind of gets at one of the things that I found most exciting about moving from graduate school into working. And that was kind of reconnecting with things about myself I'd forgotten about and things that I enjoyed, like working in that environment as a camp counselor kind of thing. That there's a sense of teamwork and camaraderie that you miss when you're in that narrow focus of graduate school. And those experiences can also, just writing them down, that they're your experience, can help to re-inspire you to find different career paths and satisfactions too, that you might have forgotten you like.
This is, as I'm scanning the questions in anticipation in a few minutes of turning this entirely over to the audience questions, one person has already asked about the really difficult and for me, just personally painful to know that this attitude is still out there. And I'm not naive, I know it is, but the attitude I'm talking about is faculty, typically tenured faculty in universities, who are not supportive or sympathetic to current graduate students or recent PhDs who have finished their programs as they embark on the search for jobs outside academia. I mean, and I could say, I just will briefly say the obvious thing, that such an attitude is not only cruel and unkind on so many levels, but just so narrow-minded and out of touch with reality, given the available jobs out there. So in academia, so we know that, we've said that. But turning to the question of how one can cope with that situation, I think what you've all just said is one step to answering that question, to talking with a resistant faculty member advisor and saying, I know you are looking at my experience and the experience of scholars in our department in a certain way, but when I look at it, I think I see it as relationships, I see it as organizing, I see it as publishing, I see it as circulating information and getting people to act on their new knowledge. A whole, and I'm thinking here, translating into running a department colloquium, preparing to teach. I mean, all the things that graduate students do. But so that can be, I think, a useful step in a conversation with a faculty member who is building a wall and saying, don't leave the monastery. Don't go out there to the nasty culture that is anti-intellectual and shallow and useless. Stay in here with us. And if you must leave, I don't know if I'll ever have time to speak with you again. So reorienting the conversation can help.
You must be talking about the professor who told me, the thought of you going to work in Congress is really terrifying because it'll mess you up and you won't actually have a pure sense of how to study Congress.
It's difficult to know what to say to that, right? Yeah, but please, all of you, how you navigated this or your advice would be really helpful.
It's a great question, and obviously my implication by bringing up that anecdote is that I think that kind of thinking infects both the substance of what academia does, as well as how well professors can mentor and support their students. I think it's just helpful to remember we all have multiple identities. Like, I mean, if any of you have kids, you know that sometimes you just have to be patient with them because they're like really naive in their views. And I think the same is true as some faculty. And it's helpful to remember that one is, an academic or a scholar, but also a citizen and a family member and, a person who can play other roles in life, and that helps one put into perspective something. I think also the power dynamics and hierarchy inside academia are not great. And frankly, to be honest, how to put this diplomatically, the EQ of the typical university faculty member is not always low. It's sometimes very high, but not always very high. So when it's dealing with people who have to be coached sometimes to let their own graduate students say something like, well, professor, I see your point. I have a different perspective. Here's an alternative mindset, and I'm going to defend it. I don't need to defend it to you, however. And I think what I'm suggesting takes some resilience. It's not easy. I think institutions themselves should be more supportive. I think administrators, if they're smart, will help socialize faculty to understanding that if graduate programs don't effectively bank on 10, 15, 20, 30% of their grads going into something that's non-academic, they will shrink, and eventually faculty positions will too.
Anyone else have advice for people navigating challenging conversations with their advisors?
I was fortunate to be in a program that was pretty accepting of going in non-academic directions, not necessarily working while you also had a fellowship. So I just avoided those conversations. But one of my colleagues, while she was getting her PhD, had a difficult advisor. And she tells the story of how she dealt with that advisor. It's basically kicking the advisor off of her committee and moving on to someone else. And she always says that it's really important to do that if you need to, that this is your experience. And if you've got someone who's not on board with what you want out of it, then work on getting them not on your committee.
That's great advice.
For me, I was definitely all the way in the monastery. By the time I came into my program, they had recognized that they didn't need to produce that many PhDs in my field. So there were limited numbers of people who got taken in, and we were intended to go out the other end with a PhD and take the jobs that there were. So I think that intentional downsizing made them very protective of us, and my advisors used to fight. I mean, one of the sort of classic stories of my experience was when it came time for the meeting where you defend your dissertation idea. It's a time limited thing. There's a timekeeper, an outside observer. There's all this formality around it, and they got into a fight that ran out the clock. So I got to proceed because they were screaming at each other, and one of them was crying. And everybody's gone now, so you can't find these people anymore. But that's just a classic. It was terrible. The behavior was terrible, and it was appalling. And I left the campus and got a job on another campus to sort of be in a different environment, to be with people who would encourage me to write and think and read things that I wrote, and not get into conversations like, why are you writing about women? There were no women who were important in the 18th century. Women were the only thing that was important in the 18th century. You should bring out the voices of women. And so I had, either you put that chapter in, take it out, or I'm not going to sign off on it. And here I am, and it would have delayed my completion of my degree to find a whole new department, because they were the only people, that was the only game in town. So I would have loved to be able to do what Steve said and just say, okay, all of you are fired. You're ridiculous and you can't have this job. But I had to try to get my way through that. And, the thing I did was to find people all the way outside of my department. And it was the department I had worked in as an undergrad. The people who had recommended that I go to graduate school in the first place, I sort of went to them and said, okay, you said this was a good idea. What am I doing wrong? How do I navigate? And they, they were part of the community. They knew those people and they knew how they had navigated. And that was a backdoor to just being sustained and told it's fine. You're not crazy. You still have to put up with it, because I think that was a lot of it. I mean, that's another one of the hidden skills that we can put up with a lot. People who have a PhD have probably put up with a lot and navigated some really difficult personalities and some really arbitrary situations and come out the other side, with a credential. But it should probably be in mediation as well as in French literature in my case, because there was an awful lot of emotion and, a fair amount of crying that went on in my department. So.
Oh, boy. Well, and now last question before I turn really exclusively to audience questions and your conversation in a free-flowing way. Now that we have stereotypes in a way, or I mean, not stereotypes, this is your experience. I didn't mean to rewrite it there. I'm taking your experience. It does connect or raise the association of some stereotypes of academics in the world outside, namely that they're disconnected, their EQ is low, they're self-absorbed and over emotional, and very and you know, living in an ivory tower and disconnected from other walks of life. So so with that in mind, that there are these stereotypes out there, could the three of you talk about, and maybe it would help to think of the following thought experiment, that, you know, if you're in a group like the group Stephanie mentioned a few minutes ago, you're with your peers, people who are doing hiring, people who are not academics, who don't have PhDs, who again, don't know academia very well, but who might be formed or shaped or influenced by these stereotypes of academics. What do you or would you say to them to get them to think of hiring PhDs in the humanities and interpretive social sciences as a good thing? How would you make the pitch? I know that's a tough one, but it's another commonly asked question, what to say to employers who might be skeptical of hiring a PhD.
I mean, I think there are little kernels of it in everything everybody has said. I think that, you know, for me, it would depend on what they were after, because I think there's the components of it. I mean, the project management, the, you know, ability to persevere, the intensity of focus, the commitment to some idea, the sort of dogged resiliency, those are all things that some employers might be interested in. But I also think there are some people who would be interested in your ability to kind of stay even when there's craziness happening around you. And, you know, and to come out of it kind of laughing and saying like, that's nothing, look what happened to me. And, you know, and to have these war stories that have somehow we don't think we behave this way, but we have all seen this behavior. And, you know, without the stereotype of that, I mean, I think, again, there probably are other professions where the same kind of stuff is happening, but they don't have movies about the people in them, or they don't write books about the people. And so you don't get a firm idea that this is what a professor always acts like. And they always have the, you know, the long hair and the patches on their elbows. And that kind of thing, I think for me, there are so many skills that people have to navigate. There's also financial management. I mean, most graduate students have to really figure out how they're going to afford to live and eat and maybe raise a family and, you know, support family at home. I mean, everybody I knew had some really complex situation that they were juggling that was outside of trying to figure out how they would read all the things they were supposed to read, write all the things they were supposed to write, teach somebody else something, be kind to a friend who was falling apart. I mean, all those things happened all the time. And we all just naturally had all those skills, you know, and professors had them too, or they wouldn't have been able to get through it and be professors too. And, you know, so I think it's funny that we have to defend the profession, but there's really nothing, I can't think of anything you wouldn't have been exposed to in grad school. It's a really good proving ground for most professional enterprises. I mean, we learn to do everything at a certain point.
Anything to add?
I mean, I think that was really well put. I
Perfect.
might just add two quick thoughts. One is just in terms of the buckets we've been talking about over the last few minutes. So there's resilience, there's ability to go really deep on a subject, there's good judgment, kind of like when the system works really well. I mean, we've been talking about academia in terms that maybe play up some of the challenges, but many of us were very lucky in some ways and had, you know, great advisors and insightful colleagues. And there's real depth that comes from that, in a sense of how to deal with ideas in a way that is helpful. And then there's a good communications piece. Good academic thinking and writing is compelling. And really good writing is, even in an age where there's computer-generated text that's going to get better and better in the next few years, like really good judgment about how to put together a document that makes the key points and communicates the right ways is something that many professionals don't have. And that's sort of the stock and trade of what so many of us have done in academia.
Terrific. Well, I'm gonna start reading out some questions, and I may modify or combine questions as I find them, because we have a bunch. So we'll try to address as many as we can while still giving rational and more or less complete answers. I'm struck by this question from Carla Mulford, and she says, who helped each of you learn the expectations of professional organizations, whether universities? And we've already talked about Stephanie spoke very eloquently about the gap between living in a department as a student or a faculty member, and then all the apparatus that actually makes the university run and that can feel like another universe. So who helped each of you learn the expectations of organizations, whether universities or outside agencies? She goes on to say, sometimes I have difficulty conveying how very important it is to handle oneself like with professionalism. So how does one help students? It sounds like this is coming from a faculty member. How does one help students understand what professional demeanor looks like, why it matters? How did you learn it? How did you develop a professional persona that worked, that played well outside academia?
Summer jobs and volunteering outside of academia, mostly just interacting with people in office spaces and places, and then seeing what their particular cultures were. I think it helped maybe some on that score that I had some different regional experiences like DC, the Northeast versus California. But if you're at all kind of anthropologically or sociologically inclined, you begin to see patterns in what people wear and how they socialize and interact with each other, and just kind of listening and being attentive to that helps. And then we go back to the very first thing we talked about, is just like connecting with people and being willing to have them say no. But when you find mentors, finding those with whom you can have a more candid conversation about the sort of the hidden norms and stories behind the ones. And I guess in my case, so I was sort of navigating academia, law, government, eventually kind of philanthropy and nonprofits, international affairs. And in each one of those domains, I looked for 2 or 3 people who had worked with me a bit and gotten to know me, and then I could move on to asking them kind of deeper questions about their own careers and trade-offs, or how their institutions made decisions about who fit in and who didn't, which are kind of sensitive topics that also reflect various kinds of predispositions people have. They get complicated.
For me, I hung out with the Europeans, and they had a lot to say about what that looked like in America, what everybody was wearing, and how all of it was unprofessional. It was actually kind of a funny, they always had things to say about different departments. Mathematicians look like this and scientists look like that. And, they were very keen observers without being anthropologists of, what American culture was. And, because they had come from outside of it and had to understand it themselves, they talked about it a lot, which is, I hadn't really thought about that, but we heard about that in class. People would regularly say, do you believe that person is, wearing that or doing that or eating that, or, those kinds of things that came up a lot. But maybe it was also because people were studying it and really trying to, understand it and bounce things off of us too, as, you live here. Why is that happening? Why do people do that here? That was sometimes, just a in-between seminar, kind of a conversation that happened in the hallways.
Yeah, I would say too that there is so much variation in work cultures depending on where you are, that part of it too is finding a work culture that you like and that fits you too. I've been in more formal work environments and less formal work environments. And it's kind of those experiences have kind of taught me what kind of work environment I want to foster. And I think, as Tino was saying, I think having that variety of experiences throughout your career, through summer jobs, through jobs you're doing on the side, helps you kind of gain a sense of the range of work cultures that are out there. What you like to wear to work, how much you like to be able to just wander into anybody's office versus having a much more formal way to be invited kind of culture. So it's again, putting yourself in a range of situations and figuring out what works well for you.
I think I'm not the only one, and talking to some of my own students, PhD students I'm working with, to find if you have a subscription to the New York Times or can use your library to get access to it. Roxane Gay has a wonderful column called My Work Friend that I think she's still doing but it's certainly archived on the site that will give people who haven't spent any time or much time at all in an office culture that's not academic, a taste of what kinds of issues come up exactly in this space of professional behavior. It can be really, and she's such a bracing, incisive writer and with very strong opinions and a great sense of humor. So it's a good introduction. I want to come to a question that a few people have asked in different ways that has to do with, and maybe actually this is primarily for Tino and Steve, and I also see another question just for you, Stephanie, so I want to get to that one too, because, and I only say this because Stephanie, as you said, you're in a kind of you're in academia, or you were rather in your early stages of career outside academia, still in an educational space, and this question is more about how, and you could answer it when it comes to your later career step, but how did you become aware, all of you, of the fields that you're now in? That when they were not academic adjacent, when you were sitting in your wherever you were and planning out or wondering about your next steps. I'm seeing, as I said, a number of questions in the Q&A about how students and recent PhDs can learn about what's out there when you've spent, in most cases, many years really in the world, wrapped up in studies and research. So whether it's drawing on your personal experience or advice that you would give, how does one learn what's out there, and especially those sectors that are most friendly to humanities and interpretive social sciences? And I think there's a sense too in the chat that there's, people with quantitative skills have a bit of an easier job or an edge. So the concern is really with the humanities and interpretive social sciences, where you don't have experience in data analytics or quantitative analysis. So how do you get a sense of what's out there in the world?
I can kind of speak about how one might get that sense, but I can also speak about how I actually did, which was just to start doing something. Coming out of graduate school, I applied for a short-term, fairly low-level job at the Smithsonian that a friend told me about that I thought was just going to be my kind of summer bridge before the next thing. And it ended up evolving into 12 years of various roles at the Smithsonian that kind of led me into different kinds of work. And a lot of that, and I think what anybody who goes into nonprofit work in particular will find themselves very quickly doing development, kind of advancement work, raising money for projects. So you get into a position where you're conceiving of projects and making pitches to donors, to foundations, to people you want to collaborate with on projects. And that right there opens up a whole range of types of work. Once you are managing projects, but also raising money for them and advocating for them, then you begin to have pathways into lots of different organizations. That led me personally into advocacy work, where that is what I am doing for the humanities writ large, kind of trying to tell the story of a whole range of types of humanities work, and going to Capitol Hill, which I also had experience with at the Smithsonian, to advocate for funding for the humanities. But it's that kind of just starting can allow you to learn about the range of things that you can do much more quickly than maybe pulling back and surveying the field in advance might allow you to do.
I really like that. I'm going to try to pick up on some of those themes and also note that I could answer the question by trying to do it in the abstract and thinking about how someone could go about it. But then, my own experience is probably a little sui generis. It always is. In my case in particular, I have two layers to that question. One is like the law piece, which was also kind of a joint career with the PhD. And the other is that I did spend a huge chunk, probably the bulk of my career in academia. But I think it's important to acknowledge that one subtext of our conversation is, as people prepare better for careers outside of academia and become more aware of opportunities, and I'll say more about how, it's also useful for academia and the rest of the world to become more permeable. That's already happening in different ways. There are professors of practice and so on. But I think about you, Joy, too, and the choices you've made. Like, I think in some ways, for some of us, the hard choice is to walk away from a tenured position when you're comfortable and perfectly, ensconced, and you just want to do something different because you want to have an impact on the world in a different way. But let me follow that chain of reasoning further and note that while academia is not a bad way to have an impact in some respects, it's also a very attenuated and indirect way of having an impact on the massive things that affect us. Here in this audience, there's surely concern for the future of how we preserve, transmit, and develop knowledge in general. And to think that that whole mission should be only in academia is a risky bet, first of all. If you extend it and think about things like climate, or how we're going to deal with AI, or how we're going to deal with massive disparities in wealth around the world, to think that we can't do that with that we can do that without storytelling, without some effective narrative or set of narratives or way of analyzing narratives, is kind of insane from my perspective. So to me, all that is to say, it's an argument for not treating the choice to go into academia as a disconnect from the rest of the world, but as an effort to stay engaged in some way. And I guess, in my case, and I think maybe this is the one piece of my experience that maybe generalizes more, is I never stopped being interested in the non-academic stuff when I got interested in academia. It was always like, okay, I'm going to be an academic, but can I still volunteer at this nonprofit that does tutoring? And can I still work at this campaign? And can I still, work in government? And it was always like, oh, well, that might actually reduce or even eliminate my possibility of being an academic. And I'm totally willing to take that risk. It turned out that, strangely enough, that didn't end up being a total contradiction. But I do think summer jobs before and during the academic thing were key. Because then, and here I'm just picking up at Stephen's point, you start to network and meet with people. I work at this place and that place. And in particular, apropos of what I do now, that introduced me to the think tank sector. And that is such an interesting sociological sort of complement to academia, because I've gone from one system to another, from federal to state, from academia to think tank. And I'll just note, here's a really imperfect analogy, but if you compare federal law enforcement, the LAPD, the military police, and an inspector general's office in a major government department, they're all sort of similar, but they're very different. And that's true of academia and think tanks. And very early on, having those summer jobs, I became aware, not even necessarily working in a think tank, but just going to professional meetings, being part of there was a young Latino professionals group in DC when I had a summer job there working in the US Senate. And then I'm all these people work at the Migration Policy Institute or the Urban Institute or the Brookings Institute. What do they do? Who was Brookings anyway? I guess he had a lot of money, but so Carnegie, what was that? So I think it starts with a willingness to just spend a summer, I think, and then go from there.
That's terrific. I'm going to turn in an effort to reflect some of the concerns of our audience to some really nitty gritty practical questions. One of the ones that was directed at one of the questions was directed at you, Stephanie, but and again, others can weigh in. and it has to do with how people advertise, how employers advertise for jobs and list bachelor's or master's, as requirements or recommended or qualifications. But it's yet, as the questioner said, very rare to list PhD as a requirement or even a qualification. And in a sense, one might say fair enough, because the number of PhDs produced in the United States or in the world is not that high. So in a way, it wouldn't be reasonable for an employer to put that on a job ad. But what the questioner is trying to get at, I think, is the question of liability, and when one sees a master's degree as the most advanced degree listed, is it a source of worry? Does one have explaining to do? I know in a way this is going back to our earlier discussion about what you get out of the PhD, but I think what the burning curiosity among most of our academic audiences at ACLS public events is they want to hear the view from the outside, that and those worries.
It's funny, we talk about that a lot in job listings, especially because we're trying, in the modern world, we're trying to be more open to different pathways to acquiring the kind of knowledge and skills that we're looking for. And I think BA is a shorthand for a certain set of experiences that makes sense in all of our minds. We know, no matter where you went to school, that we think that a BA required certain sort of milestones, hoops to jump through, that kind of thing, that we equate the job requirements to. And a master's degree might have all of that, plus some ability to develop an independent hypothesis and figure out how to solve it, and then go about the task of pulling those resources together and solving it and writing something that's a little bit of sustained thought piece about it. And only because you can't write all of that on the LinkedIn listing do you say BA or MA. But I think, we've challenged ourselves often as an employer at Girls Think to really think, what are you trying to say? And I think PhD wouldn't be something I would say, because I do think that if I have said master's degree, what I'm trying to say is all that about make a project in your mind, figure out how to get to where you want to go, know when to turn back or delete or discard certain elements of what you thought were a good idea, how to communicate along the way, how to work with a team, as everybody's been saying, and how not to work with a team, and how to do something that's independent and be brave enough to say your own thing and speak to a larger group that has known something before you. I think those things are problematic because of that, because it is, just as Tino said, it's very different. If you got a BA in one place or another, you probably did it a very different way and had more or less handholding and more or less opposition. It doesn't really mean anything, but it's part of this world where we think we know what a professor is like, and we think we know what a BA has taught you to do. And maybe we need to get away from that, because I actually had never thought until today that it might be discouraging people or making people feel bad about having a PhD. I always kind of feel like if it says you need $2 and I have $3, then good, I'm good. I've got the $3. And so the PhD was the, BA, MA plus $1. I never really, I guess it's a self-confidence thing. I never thought I'd have to say, well, I have a PhD, I'm really sorry. I always thought, like, I'll show up and it'll be, the bonus round. And maybe that's how people just need to kind of present themselves, that, if you can explain how you got all the skills that are spoken of in a BA, maybe you just have to go in prepared to say, not only do I have a BA, I have a PhD, and I can sustain this independent project, and people can, yell at me while I'm doing it, and they can measure my margins and turn me back. I mean, all those things are possible, and maybe that's just, it's sort of a narrative that you have to kind of come in prepared with.
I want to just build on that and note that just thematically, if you take a step back, one of the challenges here is that even individual people, and certainly different people inside an organization, can have very differing views about what it means to have such a deep association to something academic. Like, in some ways, I think the word academic is like arbitrary. Arbitrary has two nearly opposite meanings. It means like totally unjustified, and it can also mean like a completely fair way of allocating something so that it's like fair among different people, right? And academic suggests sort of like depth and insight and smarts, but it also, like, we literally toss around words like, oh, that's academic, meaning that's unimportant. And so I do think, to Stephanie's point, it's just worth realizing that some proportion of people in an organization, though they shouldn't, may simply assume that somebody who's an academic, or academic in the sense of has a PhD, is impractical, is too wrapped up in herself or themselves, himself, and you know, there are ways to deal with that, but I think at the same time, ultimately, one should try one's best to still message that this is a show of depth and commitment and practicality at the end of the day, in ways that people might not fully appreciate otherwise.
And to a point that Steve made earlier, if that's what people will think of you, why do you want that job? I mean, it's, you know, at a certain level, if this is not how you want to spend your whole day explaining that your PhD meant something to you and that it was important to you and that it was a good thing. I mean, if your interview dwells too much on, you know, what's wrong with you that you got a PhD, that it's just not, you're not going to like it there. And, you know, as hard as it is to get a job and to be settled and, you know, feel that you have a place in the world, it's just not a good idea. You know, hear that when people are asking you too many questions about, you know, you people and your PhDs, it's just not a place where you'll ever really find a home.
I'd also just add to that too, that it's likely only to be a question in someone's mind, even the first job. And then after that, you've got a professional profile outside of that. And that's you will be seen for what you do. And the fact that you've got a PhD and you're doing what you're doing will be an asset.
Right.
We have a few questions here, speaking of career track and career arc, from people who are asking more generally about applying for jobs at you know, past one's 20s and 30s, so into one's 40s, 50s, and 60s. Any thoughts on how to position yourself in this job market at that stage of life, a later stage of life?
So is this transitioning from academia at that point?
Right, yes.
Sorry, go ahead, Tino.
I was just going to say, I think experience sells potentially when part of a broader narrative, and when particularly linked, I think, to the kind of wisdom to understand what an institution wants and what its culture is. I think in the think tank world, which is not small and growing, although increasingly polarized, and you know, query whether sort of what institutions are comparable to which, but it's a sector that's actually growing even now. And I think it helps a lot to understand the culture of an institution. Some think tanks really try to be more scholarly. They're less entrepreneurial. They're less interested in short-term policy impact. Some are much more keen to show, over the last 5 months, here are the meetings we had with people in government. Here's how we had an impact on the policy discourse. Here's what initiatives we began. Here's who we partnered with. And having a sense of whether your narrative fits that particular personality in the think tank world, organizational personality is really useful.
I mean, I haven't actually done this very thing, so this is more theoretical advice, but I wonder if it would be useful to try to talk to people outside of academia just to kind of get a feel for it. I think one of the things that was true when I lived and worked on a college campus was that I knew every single thing that was happening politically and socially on that college campus. And sometimes world events were a little bit less transparent to me. I mean, everything was filtered through what's this going to mean for us. And we had our own planet, really, in lots of ways. I remember, for example, being on a college campus, you know, on 9/11 and thinking, what if they come here to this campus? As though that was the next most important thing, you know, in the world, that terrorism would come to my campus. And that view that you're at the center of the universe, I think doesn't serve you when you're trying to get out and see what is happening out in the rest of the world. I think maybe just talking to people, not necessarily people who could offer you a job, but just, you know, to get a sense of what's the water cooler conversation where you are, what are people talking about, what do they care about? Just to kind of get your foot outside of academia and really feel what motivates the people there, because the same thing motivates the people on a college campus. And, you know, the politics are all really insular in lots of ways. And the rest of the world is different in that way. You know, and in a nonprofit, there's also something that's like that. And you need to figure out what that thing is. I mean, a lot of people recently have moved jobs because the things happening in the world feel urgent, and having any viewpoint outside of action feels bad to people. So people moved to nonprofits so they could do something about things that they were studying as academics, or that they were kind of benefiting from as business people. It's, you know, maybe that's also, maybe the people who are making that transition now don't have to necessarily think so much PhD, not PhD, but they can think, what do other people say? What arguments do other people use for moving to a new career right now? Maybe your argument doesn't have to be PhD centric or academic centric. It can really just be, I came, for example, to this national organization because I care about the thing you're doing. It feels really important that somebody do something right now. Not that we talk about it or, you know, lament it later on or say, oh, we saw this happening, but that we actually get in there and do things. I've had people move from corporate to nonprofit and take huge pay cuts because they feel like they need to do something. And that's equally weird as an employer, to have somebody explain, why do you want to make a third of what you make and work harder? And so I think people with a PhD might be thinking they really have a lot of explaining to do, but everybody has explaining to do when they, you know, jump sectors or move into something that's not what they've been doing. And you know, so the advice would be just step outside of yourself a little bit and see what people are talking and thinking about, and see if you really have to explain quite as much as you do, or maybe you're explaining the wrong thing. Maybe you're trying to explain away a degree when you should be really thinking about, why are you moving from, you know, tenure to not tenure?
Great insights. And I'm going to ask one more practical minded question, because we always get the best feedback. People say, oh, the feedback was so concrete, the discussion was so concrete, it really helped. It really gave me insight into the issue. This is a question going back to an earlier piece of the discussion about learning outside when one has been in an academic program as a graduate student or a faculty member for a long time. When all of you think back on, you know, the informational interviews, no doubt you have given people, and the advice, and one might even call it informal mentoring, that you've given to people seeking to make some kind of career change. What are the questions either you've asked when you've been in that situation, or you've been asked in an informational interview, that you find elicit the best advice? I hope that question is clear. Sounds like it's a student or a faculty member who's thinking of changing careers and wants to learn and start to set up some informational interviews, but doesn't know quite what to ask.
I mean, there are different ways to come at that, but just I do find it useful to either be interrogated about, or to interrogate people about timeframes, which is something we're always limited in how much we can actually do that, but to sort of say, if you were to go back 10 years and talk to yourself, what would you say? Or 10 years from now, where would you like to be? Or 10 years ago, how much of what you're doing did you sort of plan out? Like the stuff Stephanie started with at the very beginning of our event, I just found really fascinating and enlightening about, like, okay, I want to be college administrator, but how do I get there? Have to get through the PhD, and just sort of the navigation of that. So eliciting that kind of dialogue by getting people a little out of, what do you think you want to do this moment? And instead, like, what's the arc of your life? Like, where have you been and where do you want to go? I think is useful. And I when people provoke that dialogue in me, I think I can sometimes be more helpful to them.
Yeah. When people ask me what I like and don't like in a really concrete way, I think that's also telling, because I think people also romanticize pretty much every job. And I, you know, if I answer those questions honestly, I think I can help people understand, you know, because I think people often think, you know, if you're president and CEO, you have a ton of power. If you're, you know, at the head of an organization, you have a lot of power. And if you're looking for power, this is really, really not the job. I think faculty member would be better. You should stay there, more leverage. But, you know, it's to be honest about those things and to let people ask me questions like that and tell the truth. I think that is probably when it's most helpful, because I do think people want a thing. They don't necessarily know how to ask the question, but they want to be, you know, I think going back to the points that everybody's making, they want to like getting up and going to that job a lot of the time. Nobody ever is going to like every single thing every single day, but for me, you're striving for a balance of days that you feel good on the way in and feel good when you go home. and, days that you just think like, why do I even get out of the bed? I think helping people see some of that a little bit better, and letting people really ask you that, like a core question, not a question about, what job skills are most important and, what should I have studied, which math courses should I have taken, those kinds of things. I know people do ask that, but I think that I tell people those are really the wrong questions, because especially where I work, there wasn't a graduate preparation for this job. It's, everything everybody does could help you do this job.
And I can share, I'm not sure how this advice is elicited from me during those interviews, but I can share one of the main pieces of advice that I give to graduate students looking to transition, is to be prepared to take a job that's at a lower level than you think you might deserve, and to connect with with the kind of organization and its mission that you want to be connected with, but to be prepared to take a lower level job. Your abilities will come through quickly once you're in that role, and then you'll rise up. But don't go into the process thinking that you need to get a job that a PhD should have. Go in, just the best way to get a job is to get a job, and then to worry about the next step later.
That's in the spirit of what you just said, Steve. I'll say for those faculty who are and graduate students who, like Stephanie, in her first career step beyond the classroom, are looking to the nooks and crannies of universities and colleges themselves. I found that I learned the most as I started taking on administrative, bigger and bigger administrative roles, that I learned the most from the associate directors and associate deans who reported to me, who had typically seen many directors and deans and then provosts and then interim presidents come and go, and knew what, had very strong ideas about what they wanted me in those different roles to do, or the person in those different roles to do, and who gave just brilliant insight into the way the university worked. So I would say, just joining in the chorus of advice giving here, and as the lesser member of the three of you, stellar responses and advice, I would say that as a current graduate student or recent PhD or current faculty member, thinking both about the university and the college and its structure, but also kind of more corporate structures or institutional structures more broadly, speaking to the non-academic administrative staff, from one's department manager or administrator, whatever the title is, to associate dean or someone in admissions or the registrar's office. They're really they're under-tapped immense resources there, and they're 99% of the time really eager to help and talk and share their sense of the school with people who often don't come to them looking to them for advice and looking to them as sources of wisdom. I want to say in closing, before I thank our really stellar panelists, that a couple of questions were raised in the chat about curriculum and about how doctoral curriculum should change, and how curricula are already changing, and how faculty attitudes and administrative attitudes are already changing to facilitate the efforts of students, of PhDs and faculty too, seeking to take the steps that our panelists have already taken in such extraordinary ways. And we, as I said at the beginning, we're deeply, deeply interested in this at ACLS. We have one program, I'll just give a couple of examples. One program, the Mellon Scholars in Society program, was a 3-year program placing scholars in projects in organizations outside the academy for 1 year, after which they would return to their department and bring something of what they had learned into planning for the doctoral curricula in their department and ideally beyond. So we're working on that curricular phase now and with those scholars. And that's just one of the ways in which we are seeking to accelerate and connect the many conversations going on around the country that are run by faculty and students too, together, who want to make PhDs in the humanities and interpretive social sciences more flexible, more permeable, to break down the walls between academia and the doctoral program, both to equip doctoral students with more career opportunities when they finish the PhD, but also, and I'm speaking to a theme you all raised in different ways, and so did some of our questioners, to really shift culturally what humanistic knowledge is and what this accredited thing we call a PhD symbolizes, what it stands for. It can mean knowledge, book learning, to use an old-fashioned term, but it really means much more than that, and is a crucial element in the workings, in the operations, and the health and robustness of the world in which we live. So that's one effort. I will say too, institutionally, our loose design workshop for a new academy is very much a space in which thinking about accelerating change to reform doctoral curricula, to open up, to broaden, to embrace the world, and to smooth paths between and across academia and the world outside is actively going on. So please watch this space for more news to come from our various fellowship programs and what they're teaching us about doctoral curricula, to our loose design workshop for a new academy and its forthcoming events next year. And in closing, I want to thank very earnestly and heartily our three panelists, Tino, Cuéllar, Stephanie, Hull, Steve, Kidd. Thank you so much. I wish we were all in person because I would take you out for dinner now, but let me just thank you for your brilliant comments. Thank you.
Yes, love a rain check on that. Thank you.
Great. I'd be happy to do that. And thank you to all our audience for your participation and terrific questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but we hit a bunch. Please come back next year. We will. We've set a high bar now. I don't. We're going to have a tough time getting people to come to follow these amazing panelists, but we will indeed return to these themes. And until then, I wish you a good evening and a happy and productive and above all healthy summer. So take care, everyone. Thank you.